I think Xi Jinping's biggest influence on leadership is he's tried to make it more Chinese, more practical, more pragmatic.
In my many interviews with foreigners, I've often found them to be generous in sharing their thoughts on Chinese President Xi Jinping. American Professor William Brown of Xiamen University has also talked extensively about the president. What sets him apart from other foreign experts is that he first met Xi in person more than 20 years ago and has maintained correspondence with him.
I sent him my off-the-wall book because he's the one that encouraged me to write more books. When he sent 2 people to Hong Kong to the hospital to encourage me and hope I got well and come home to Fujian, I was so moved by that I cried.
Could you share with us your first encounter with him?
Well, in the late 90s, they had meetings in Fuzhou and they invited me to those meetings. He's so calm and quiet. He doesn't say much. I didn't know him that well, but the first time that it had a big impression on me was when I was in Hong Kong and I had cancer, and I was supposed to be in the hospital 6 days, ended up 2 months with several surgeries, and friends visited and said, if I get out of the hospital, am I going home? I don't want to go to the US, I want to go back to China. And then Xi Jinping, at that time was acting governor, and he sent 2 people to the hospital in Hong Kong with flowers to visit me and said he hoped I got well and came back home to China. Wow. I was so moved, I remember I cried. And so I decided, I'm going to get out of here. And I started walking up and down the halls with all my tubes and everything, pulling them. And I was so moved because even though I'd seen him in meetings in Fuzhou, and I'm just a teacher, but he heard about it and he sent people to visit me. So I was very moved by that. But then later, I met many other people that had known him earlier. 5, 10, 20 years later, he still remembered their names of their children. He remembered the name of a driver. And he asked them personal questions, just like with me. He really is the kind of person that likes to know people's situation. But then the first time that I met with him was in November 2001. He gave me the honorary citizen of Fujian, gave me a nice little trophy, and he gave me 500 business cards, the honorary citizen of Fujian on them. That was really special. One, that's when he encouraged me to write more books. I'd only written at that time a shaman book and a couple of textbooks. But that night he said, China has come to understand the world, but the world still doesn't understand China. And he said, we need to tell China's story better. That's over 20 years ago. And then he said, you wrote a book about Xiamen, your second home. You should write a book about Quanzhou, your third home. But I've been to Quanzhou many times, but he was interested in Quanzhou because that's the start of the Maritime Silk Road that inspired the Belt and Road Initiative.
And then what's the next one?
Well, the next one, in 2018, I wrote a book, Off the Wall, How I Fell for China.
Yes.
Since my first month in China, I'd written over 1,000 letters to family and friends about China and the changes. Because when I first came to China in '88, I found very quickly China is not at all like what I had pictured. So I wrote the book, and then I sent a copy of the book to Xi Jinping. I sent it with a letter, thank you letter, because he's the one who encouraged me to write more books. I was really shocked when he replied, and he sent me 2 of his books.
Does it come with an autograph?
Well, he didn't sign the books, but he signed the letter. To me, this is the most special. One thing is, now I've written, I guess 20 books or so by now, so I thought, well, I'm pretty good, maybe relax a little bit. But in his letter, he wrote that he had confidence that in the future I would write even better stories about China. So basically what he's saying is keep writing. Well, that's Xi Jinping. He doesn't ever stop. and he wants us to keep telling China's story. I've been in China 30-some years, and I've driven 200,000 kilometers around China to see everything personally. So I thought this is a great opportunity. But then I think it's not just opportunity, it's a responsibility. A lot of people today don't understand China any better now than I did in '88. So I keep writing. Just shortly after that, the Lianghui and the Fujian delegation went to Beijing. This is 20 years after he had sent people to visit me in Hong Kong when I had cancer. 20 years later, as part of his precious time with the Fujian delegation, he asked them, has Bill Brown retired yet, and how is his health? Wow, 20 years later, he remembered? That really moved me. He remembers people. And all over China, I've met people that have known him, He remembers these things because they're important to him. He cares about common people.
If you hadn't met him, would your life now be totally different?
I would have written fewer books because I only wrote the shaman book. I saw foreigners didn't understand China, so I thought I'd write about shaman because that's my home. But I never thought of writing more books. I'm not an author, I'm a business teacher. So it's 2001 when he encouraged me to write the book. I thought it's nice of him, it's cutchy, polite. But then in 2002 I helped shamans enter this international event for livable cities, and they won the gold. So the next year Quanzhou asked me to represent them in Europe. So I agreed, but they had no foreign literature. This is the start of the Maritime Silk Road, and they had no foreign English literature for the people in Europe to read. So in 6 weeks, I drove all over Quanzhou, night and day, writing the book. But I probably wouldn't have thought of writing it if Xi Jinping hadn't encouraged me to write it 2 years early. And then after I researched Quanzhou and wrote the book, then I realized why Xi Jinping thought Quanzhou was so important. And later it inspired the Maritime Silk Road. And as I learned about Quanzhou, I was so amazed. I wrote a book about all of Fujian. And the more I wrote, the more I was intrigued, and so I got hooked, addicted to writing about China. But if he hadn't encouraged me to write more, I probably wouldn't have written. So he was a big turning point in my life twice. One, big encouragement to recover from cancer and come back to China, not go back to the US. And two, encouraged me to write.
So over the decades, how has your impression of him evolved?
When I first met him, I would have never imagined he'd be president, but in retrospect, I agree, he should have been. I mean, because I teach leadership and strategy. In my mind, he's a master leader, and he's a great strategist, he's a great entrepreneur. All over China, he's researched poor villages to find out why they're poor, and helped them get into business, find markets, and develop. He's an entrepreneur, but he's never made a penny for himself. He's always done it to help different communities. But I wondered, how can he be this way? So I went to Liang Zhehe and Zheng Ding, and I've read these books written about him. He's had the same mindset as a teenager and the same goals as he had in Fujian, or as he has now as a national leader, to help improve people's lives. We look at him as a politician, as a leader, but he's truly an entrepreneur. I would call him a social entrepreneur.
So in evaluating President Xi's leadership style, what key attributes would you use to describe it?
I think the most important thing about Xi Jinping, one is he's genuine, he's honest. He treats everybody the same, high or low. He's very task-focused, and the emphasis is always on the job, and the job is always improving people's lives. So his key priorities have been, since he was very young, fighting poverty, fighting corruption, and emphasizing sustainability, protecting the environment. I really admire that he's emphasizing cultural competence.
Professor, you've traveled extensively across China and conducted numerous interviews with ordinary Chinese citizens. So what insights have you gathered from your conversations with them regarding their perspectives on the president?
My American friends really don't understand that the Chinese really do respect President Xi Jinping. I interviewed farmers and fishermen and doctors and teachers and professors and entrepreneurs all over China, remote areas, big cities. And I asked many of the people in the poor areas, I said, why has China changed so quickly? And they said, because of good policies, that the government understands what we need. Two people in two different provinces said, because Xi Jinping loves us. When he went to 18 caves, Shabadong and Hunan, then he gave them specific advice. He's done that all over China.
What are the most significant transformations that China has undergone under the leadership of President Xi?
I think Xi Jinping's biggest influence on leadership is he's tried to make it more Chinese, more practical, more pragmatic. When he was in Xiamen, he went everywhere in Xiamen, and in Ningda, went to every village. He went out with the farmers, and he hoed with the farmers. They talked freely with him and tell him the real problem. But again, that's based on history too. I think he's my first barefoot party secretary, Xi Jinping. 70 years ago, China had barefoot doctors. They lived in the poor areas with the poorest people, saved a lot of lives. Xi Jinping, I think he's like a barefoot secretary. And today, this is a big influence of Xi Jinping. When I drove around China in 2019, in Mongolia or Yunnan or in Tibet, 5,000 meters death zone, people volunteered to go live in those places for 3 years with the poorest people. And like Xi Jinping, study the problems and see what they can do to help improve their lives. And that was from his theory, his ideas, and from his modeling. And there's hundreds, millions of volunteers across China working in remote poor areas because they're motivated by the example of people like Xi Jinping. I think if the world is objective, they will look at Xi Jinping as a real history-changing guy, as a real leader.
And looking ahead, what do you foresee as the most prominent challenges and opportunities facing both the president and the CPC?
Domestically, I think that the big challenge is that you want to emphasize rural revitalization. That is a long-term strategy. There's a lot more land in the countryside than in the cities, a lot more opportunities for agriculture, for everything else. I think China needs to develop the hinterlands more. That will increase the domestic market. In China, they have good roads, bridges, and tunnels through every part of the country. So they already have the foundation for rural revitalization. The other challenge was outside of China. China has to prove that it's concerned about having mutually beneficial relationships with these countries. It has to find ways to help these countries develop. The Belt and Road Initiative, China has helped so many countries with this. China's been heading that way in the world.